Douglas promised not to snatch the microphone off. After leaving school, Douglas went to college to study photography for 2 years. Then joined the family firm D.P.A. Annan Limited. This was set up by his great-great-grandfather in 1855. By this stage, the business was principally involved in art dealing, but continued to sell many of the old Glasgow photographs, and you'll be able to see some here today. Douglas developed a picture framing side to the business. In 2026, it was felt right to leave the art dealing side of the company, and this was passed on to others. Douglas retained the old photographs of the family and firm's archived materials. In 2008, Douglas moved on to a totally different world, working in the financial side of the Royal Dutch Shell, thinking that this would be a short-term arrangement. But stayed there for over 8 years and also became their official Glasgow photographer. In 2016, the opportunity came to leave Shell, and for several years, Douglas researched and catalogued the family and firm's archives. These are now in the National Galleries of Scotland collection. He's also supplied Annan photos of old Glasgow to various media and publishing organisations, including Glasgow Museums and the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. He visits all kinds of groups and societies to give illustrated talks and lectures, for example, Old Glasgow, Through the Lens, and Glasgow, Old and New.
Thank you very much. It's quite funny listening to your life passing before your eyes like that. I feel as though I'm at a funeral, but anyway. It's lovely to be here. I'd like to say at the outlet, this is not a lecture. I'm from Glasgow, so this is a wee letter. So feel free to interrupt me at any point. Because I go to various talks and things, and you're sitting there and you see maybe an image comes up on the screen and you think, I'm going to ask at the end of the question time, and then the talk goes on and you get to the end, any questions? And you go, oh, what was I going to ask? So stick your hand up. If I don't pay any attention to your hand, I've found the best thing is to throw something at me. Recently a £5 note's been quite good, whatever suits you. What I would like to do today is the early years of my photographic journey. So those of you that have seen my talk before, Libby, will be delighted you'll not see any of my images, because trust me, you're better seeing the old ones. We'll talk a wee bit about that maybe as we go along. My links to Fife are a little bit tenuous, but I went to holiday in the village of Ely for about 18 years. I don't know if that counts. You know? I was married in Glenrothes. Does that count? Right? But also my great-great-grandfather, Douglas Annan, was born and brought up in Daresay, just along the road from Cooper. So hear a wee bit about him as the talk goes on. What I've also brought along today on the right-hand table are dozens and dozens of prints. Please, if you're at all interested, take as many as you like. One of the reasons for that is we move house next Friday, so anything that you don't need to move, much appreciated. So you're doing me a favour. Don't feel you have to give a wee donation to the charity if you don't want to, or you're not able to. Please just take the prints. I was saying to my own camera club, I'm in Mulcahy and Bearsden, although when we move we'll probably leave there, but I said to them, I brought along some modern prints of the old photographs, and then I actually worked it out, the so-called modern prints were printed over 50 years ago, and that made me feel really old. So, if I was standing here in front of you and I had lined up here 10 photographic historians, and I turned to these learned ladies and gentlemen and said, when was photography invented? The 10 ladies and gentlemen would give at least 25 different answers. It depends who you talk to, and it depends what you think photography is as to when photography was invented. I choose the date 1840. So it was around 1841 that William Henry Fox Talbot down in Oxfordshire, Lake Happy, produced a means to reproduce an image. Now by that, those of you of certain age, if I say produced an early form of negative, will know what I mean. Prior to that, there had been various attempts, there were various techniques, daguerreotypes over in France, of course, but there were also a lot of ways of capturing a single image, whether it was light painting, as they used to talk about, where you had sensitive paper and you maybe put the petals of a flower, or a fern is a famous one that you can see that Fox Talbot did, on the paper, and you exposed light, obviously sunlight in those days, onto the top of the fern, took the fern away, and then you were able to develop the paper and have an image in a sense of that. But Fox Talbot created a means to create more than one image in 1840. In 1855, my great-great-grandfather, Douglas Annan, opened a photographic studio in the West End of Glasgow. So you think that's only 15 years after the start of photography, so it was very, very early. He was indeed a pioneer photographer. It was interesting when you look back at the history of it to see some of the images during the talk that he took. But it was interesting, I was doing research a number of years ago, and Douglas Annan sadly died in 1887. And I was able to, somebody was doing research on the firm and the family, and got a copy of his death certificate. And what was very sad and perhaps interesting was death. The cause of death, self-inflicted wounds to the neck after a period of mental aberration. Now, one of the theories around that, I don't know if anybody's ever done any research, is the exposure to chemicals. You may have heard the term Mad Hatter, when in the early days of making hats and so on, there was exposure to mercury, which literally, breathing that fumes in did cause mental health issues. I don't know whether that was the cause for Douglas Annan, because the business appeared to be doing well at that time, but that was the cause of it. So what I'd like to do is go through just some of the photographic equipment, and feel free to interrupt me anytime, and then we'll look at some images. So I'm going to put this down for a second. If I shout, can you all hear me okay? Yeah. Great. £10 note, you want to throw that in, that'd be fine. So Douglas Annan in 1855 would have loved a wee camera like this. Now I say that because the camera he worked with mainly was a 12-inch by 10-inch glass plate camera. Now I was saying somebody earlier, I was doing this talk to a primary school group, and I said, and Douglas Annan used a 12-inch by 10-inch camera, and quite rightly, as it said to yourselves, a wee hand put up front row, and I said, yes, can I help you? Mister, I said, yes, what's an inch? So I'll kind of assume, in case you're not sure what an inch is, that's a 12-inch by 10-inch glass plate holder. So Douglas Annan intended to use that. This was a later camera. One of the things about problems you get with this one, you focus by means of the wheel at the side. But with this one, if you're focusing it out very, very far, obviously it's a bellows camera, sadly seen better days. But one of the big problems you used to get was you would view through here, obviously a ground glass screen there, and you'd be under the dark cloth, but the bellows would sag down and actually appear in the image. Now, the other thing about the image you saw there, it was back to front and upside down, but that's just the way it was. That's why a lot of early photographers walked like that, forever underneath the dark cloth. Now, the bellows sag issue could be quite serious. I often think it sounds a bit like a disease, perhaps a bellows sag. The solution was to have an apprentice in the company. And
And what would happen is this would be set up on what we call a field tripod in this particular case. One of these ones that the legs sprung out and would fit into the holes underneath. Feel free to look at these later on. So this would be set up. The apprentice would stand at the side, and there is literally in the middle here a little hook. And I'll just hold the bellows instead. And his job was to hold that up, like that. And if he held that up, there would be no danger of the bellows appearing in the photograph. So if you have a wee touch of bellows sag, 3 times a day So that camera was a smaller version of this. This was known as the whole plate. And if you look at these later, please feel free to open it, and inside here you'll see a glass plate negative. Now, I may be talking to folk that know exactly what they're doing, but in what I often say to groups that are not necessarily camera club groups, I say, look, there we are, this could take 2 photographs. And they kind of go, oh. And then I go into my pocket and I take out my rather old mobile phone, 2,000-3,000 photographs stored in there. And I was saying to a group, you know, the interesting thing is, if I gave this glass negative to any of you in here, maybe some of you would have the means to print it. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe I could give you a roll of film. You talked about buying an enlarger for the camera club or the association. The danger in photography now, and Colin may agree with me, is how do we preserve the archives? Because even the early digital cameras saved on that one that was saved on a floppy disk about 3 inches square, nothing can read that anymore. And I joke with my friends, I say, you know, we save everything to the cloud, but what if it's a sunny day? Maybe I've not quite got that bit right. Another camera, there's quite a range of different ones here, is this one. Now this is a very special camera to me. This is my late father's camera. And I'll take a wee note because he got it in 1937. And what I thought was interesting in the logo of your association, that there seems to be one of the characters is holding the camera, very similar to this. So this was 1937 he got this. And the reason he was given it because he was the only Scottish schoolboy to go on a trip from Scotland to Canada and the United States of America. And he went on board a steamer called the Antonia, and then went down into America, past Niagara Falls to New York, and came back on a boat you may have heard of called Queen Mary. And this was the camera he was given. Now this was obviously a bellows camera again. The way you operated that, you looked through the viewer here. You wanted to do landscape, simply turn the viewer around and you look through like that. But this one, to take the picture, there was a shutter release here. It also had the cable release that you could just squeeze. But this one, very grand, with the sports viewfinder. So he was able to look through here, put his finger there and take pictures. And recently, as part of our moving house, I came across the pictures my father took on that journey. And at some point in the future, I'll digitise it, whatever process we use. And it'll be quite interesting to do and maybe a wee talk on that. But the other thing, this came in a leather case, and on it my grandfather had got Dad's name in gold lettering, so nobody would take this camera away. Another one, possibly around about the same era, was this one. This is known as a VPC and goes by the lovely name of the Picolette. And I just think that's a lovely name. The VPC stands for Vest Pocket Camera. I do talks like this all the time on talks in Old Glasgow, and I take along some of the cameras. And I was doing a talk in the Springburn area of Glasgow, and I said, and this is a VPC, a Vest Pocket Camera. And there was somebody down in front, a lady down in front, next to a friend of mine, Vest Pocket? That would never fit in a man's sinnet. Sinnet is a vest, by the way. Vest, of course, in reference to the camera, is a gentleman's waistcoat. I'm not checking with Colin if it'll fit, but this is designed in that era to fit a gentleman's waistcoat. It also had the same viewing as before. There's a little device there that spins round, so it's landscape format or portrait. And to take the picture, the shutter releases in there. This, of course, as with the earlier one there, were roll film cameras. We were moving on from the glass plates. Just to go back to the glass plates, I have a couple of things I'd like to say about them. I'm not going to go into all the technicalities of the process, but the process Douglas Annan used for the famous old close photographs that we'll look at in a minute or two was something called wet collodion. Without going into all the chemical stuff, mostly because I don't fully understand it, the plates used, the glass plates, had to be coated almost at the time of taking the photograph. So they were 10-inch by 12-inch glass plates. Inside here there is a glass plate if you want to look at it later. It's not one of the old close ones, it's one from the 1950s. But that had to be coated, the earliest ones in 1868, just prior to the image being taken. The thing about that was the images were all taken in the East End of Glasgow, around the Dromgate area, Salt Market. Our premises were in the other end of Glasgow at that time, out of Woodlands Road. And the thing about that was, how were we going to coat the glass plates? We couldn't do it at Woodlands Road and then, well, there were no taxis as such. It would be the horse-drawn trams would take you along. But we couldn't coat them at Woodlands Road, get to the East End and take the pictures. So what my great-great-grandfather did, they got a handsome cab and they actually darkened, usually just one or maybe two windows on that, and they darkened that, put like, I suppose, a heavy material over it, so and then it's light sensitive. It would then be put into the back of the camera after they'd done all the focusing. What you would do then is slide that out the back. So now, at the front of the camera, obviously the lens, usually with a leather cup over it, no such thing as shutters in those days. You would then, as I always say, you would then, if you imagine that's the camera, take the cap off the lens and go away and have a cup of tea and a biscuit. The exposure time for the old closes in some cases would be minutes. Now, you think now, and I don't know what you're using camera-wise, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 frames a second. You're talking about minutes. And that brings me on to the sort of Victorian family portraits. How many, maybe you've seen them, maybe they're in some in the club, and you see the family portrait, generally the lady is seated and the gentlemen are standing behind. And almost without exception, they look miserable. And you'll see the gentleman will be like this, and the lady will be. One of the reasons the ladies sometimes look scared is they would have a clamp on their neck, literally a clamp, and that would come up behind the chair, and it's shaped like that. And I saw one, I think it was at Lake Abbey, Fox Talbot's Museum, and it sat like that, but there was an adjustment, so you could get it as tight as you can. Each to their own, but often the photographer would get the lady to rest in it, and then say, and don't move. And the other thing, the exposure time, as I say, for the outdoor photographs, might have been, especially in the road closest, very dark area, it might have been maybe around about 30 seconds to a minute. In the studios, quite often studios on the top floor, and you could pull back the curtains. Julia Margaret Cameron was very well known for that. I think she had a studio at one time down in the Isle of Wight, and she had curtains that you could pull back depending how much light you wanted and what sort of effect you were looking. So in the studio, let's say studio portrait would be 20 seconds. Now when you go home, stand in front of the mirror and smile for 20 seconds. I defy you to hold that smile. You can go. And it's really hard actually to hold the same smile. but it's dead easy to look miserable. 20 seconds, I have a friend who's looked miserable for 20 years. But it is easy to do it. To go back to the old close photographs, there's about 3 examples here, which I'm keeping well away from the ones I want to take. These are what they call contact prints. So that's the full size of the glass negative. Now, you mentioned in your talk, I think, Photoshop, something called Photoshop, 1997, roughly, yeah. And you mentioned the picture of the lightning being added on the right. When was that done?
1940s.
1940s. Don't know if any of you were at the Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh for the Buckham exhibition of the aeroplanes in flight. They were all joined together. So Photoshop, yes, 97. But there was something even earlier than that, and I happen to have it here. This is, I calculate this is Photoshop minus 150 version. And what I'll do, please have a look at it later. But what it basically is a stand, if I hold it there. And that's effectively, the other bit I've put down would have at one time been hinged on here to come up like that. And what this is a negative retouching. So down here, say, have a look where my thumb is waving about, is a mirror. So you could set this up either outside or in this room and get the light from outside by adjusting the mirror to shine onto the back of this ground glass screen. You would then put your negative, your glass negative on there, and that's when you would retouch it. Because you're getting a good light source coming in, you're able to retouch it. The retouching could take different forms depending on what the image was. There's a couple of printouts there of which show you how the actual retouching area would work, and there we can see somebody actually working with it. But in the case of Thomas Annan's 1868 Photoshop work, I should add, what he used to do, and I can show you this, I'll leave it lying there. In the middle here, these are obviously the buildings. In the middle would be the sky, funnily enough. But glass plate negatives are not brilliantly sensitive to all different tones of colour, so that would have come up very mucky. And the other point is, in these closes there wasn't really a lot of daylight. The Glasgow in 1868 was very smoky, so this would have been a horrible grey colour. So Thomas Annan, or one of his assistants, would sit at a screen much bigger than that and paint the glass plate negative black. So he would actually paint the sky in black, and in this particular case, and I do apologise, great grandfather, he didn't do a very good job because it's right down over the edge of the building. But if he painted it black in the negative, when it's printed, it comes up white, so you get a lovely crisp sky, and that gives a contrast with the texture of the buildings. So that was 1868, so photo editing is nothing new. The other thing Thomas Annan did was a series of books, and I brought one of them along here. This has got the very lovely title of The Old Country Houses of the Old Glasgow Gentry. And he would produce these books. Now, I'm not sure, and nobody's got any of your records, I think he did these on his own volition, as it were, and then probably sold them to the people. Because this one dates from about 1878. Now, in 1878, it's not like today where everyone's got a phone that can take a photograph. Not many people had cameras. Cameras were really for wealthy individuals who had an interest in that sort of thing, or professional photographers. So he would produce this book, and what the book does, it contains lots of photographs of specific buildings. The one the page is open at is Hag's Castle on the south side of Glasgow. And these are all images that have been stuck into the book. So please feel free to have a look. But as was said earlier, maybe keep your tea and coffee just a wee bit further back. He also was commissioned to do photographs Capture Waterworks scheme, and we'll see a picture of Queen Victoria later on at that. When we think about the old close photographs, those who have any interest in history of photography and know of Douglas Annan, you think of these sorts of images from 1868. Now, there was a lot of research done. You maybe heard that I had supplied some images to the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, and that was probably about 2016, round about then, which I found quite amusing because they were putting on an exhibition of Douglas Annan's photographs all the way to the other side of America. And we're hoping in years to come there'll be a big exhibition in Edinburgh about the whole family's work. But the old close images, it was often believed, I choose my words very carefully when I talk, it was often believed he was commissioned by the City of Glasgow Improvement Trust to take photographs of the closes to show just how poor the conditions were. And there's a lovely one here of a wee girl sitting on the steps. Is that one there? You can see there's a wee boy there, and so I think it's actually maybe geese in the background. But the conditions were horrendous. But there's no record within the Glasgow Corporation, Glasgow City Council archives relating to City of Glasgow Improvement Trust commissioning Douglas Annan. What I believe, when he lived in Daresay, his father, who was John Annan, who was a miller at Liddops Mill just outside Daresay, they were very involved in the local church, and they had a real compassion and a sense of Glasgow compassion to the poor. And I think he took the photographs. There's a wee bit of research done. He was friendly with somebody within the Glasgow authority at that time, and he took the photographs and then showed them to some members of the City of Glasgow Improvement Trust. Because to be honest, some of them, although in that trust, wouldn't ever have gone anywhere near here. There was a quotation in one of the newspapers about Glasgow and it being the most dreadful city in the world. You dare not enter close without a constable. So these photographs were taken, they were given to the City of Glasgow Improvement Trust, who then asked them to be bound into albums. So they were then bound into albums and they were presented to Parliament down in Westminster, and the City of Glasgow Improvement Trust Act was passed and funding was made available to demolish a lot of these and provide fresh, clean housing. So that was Douglas Annan. He had several family, maybe two sons that became quite well known. John Annan, who was my great-granduncle, he was my great-grandfather rather. He became, if you like, a commercial photographer. He did a lot of things like shipbuilding, because in those days, in the sort of late 1800s, shipbuilding companies didn't have their own photographic departments, so we would be commissioned to photograph bits of ships, hulls being laid down. But his brother was one James Craig Annan, and he became a very famous photographer. He would have definitely taken part in some of the salons in those days. I came across a medal from Blair Bowley, from Madras, and then he had linked with Alfred Stieglitz in America. He also linked to Neo Hill and Adamson through in Edinburgh, but that's a whole new talk. No time to go into that. But James Craig Annan's possibly his most famous photograph, we'll see later, was Charles Jenny Mackintosh. And he photographed Mackintosh, the famous portrait of the floppy bow tie we'll see in a minute. And that's, if you like, James Craig Annan was, and I think, a sort of artistic photographer. He had a real vision for the image. John Annan was taking a picture of the boat on the stalks of the street, whereas James Craig Annan, and he also produced things called photogravures with his lovely tones in the picture, so he was a wee bit different from that. So we need, before we look at photographs, I think we need three things to take a photograph. We need something to photograph, we need a means to record it, whether it's a camera or whatever it is, and we need light Now it's fine if it's a reasonable day like this, a nice light talk. In the early days of photography, if you were doing something indoors, didn't quite have electronic flash in those days. This was the next best thing. And this was basically the magnesium flash gun. And basically, very simple to operate. Put magnesium powder in the top, and some of you may remember the old cigarette lighters that had a wheel, and you spun the wheel, that created a spark of the flint. And that's the same principle here. You pulled this down, released it, spark appeared here. Magnesium powder goes boom, you get the lovely big light for your picture. So nothing could go wrong. My father had a job to go down to Helensburgh. You know Helensburgh, the Walfall was the pier up Sinclair Street, not too far from Hill House down there. There was a big house, and the job was to go and photograph the lounge and one or two other rooms. The lounge would probably be about as big as half of this hall, huge big lounge. So Dad's job in that time as a young apprentice was to work the flash gun. He wasn't allowed to go near the camera. So over here the photographer's got the dark cloth over his head and he's focusing everything. And Dad was told to charge up flash guns, so put the powder in. And then he thought, it's actually quite a big room. And then he thought, I'm going to show my own initiative. He stood on a chair, and the photographer was so busy focusing and getting ready. He just said, are you ready? And he said, yes. And see, Dad thought if I stand in the chair, the light will go all the way to the back. So the photographer said, right, I'll tell you when, and then you just pull it down, and I'll be exposing the camera, and it'll be great. So the photographer said, right, go. And it was boom. Well, it lit up car draws. They were folk in good. But it was fine, it lit up the room, it was brilliant. So they were hacking everything away. For some reason, Dad glanced up. And there was that big black mark in the ceiling there? So the profit from that job went to a firm of painters. Another wee quick story. You said I could go on to 5 o'clock. Another wee quick story about light. There was a story told of photographing, I think it was out in the East End of Glasgow, a biscuit making factory. And it's a wonderful place. They make these wonderful chocolate biscuits. And it's basically a production line. So at that end you put in whatever you put in for chocolate biscuits. And at this end, out pop chocolate biscuits. So the photographer working out how to do it, he had an apprentice with him. And he said, right, we'll wait till lunchtime and they'll put the machine off. So that's fine, not till lunchtime. So all the bits that were doing this stopped so they wouldn't be blurred. So that was good. And then he says to the apprentice, well, if it was in here a wee bit and out, I think you'd better paint that. And the apprentice is going, paint it? He said, yeah, I need you to paint that during the photograph. So, is this like going in a long stand or a sky or whatever? No, I'll give you a torch. And during the photograph, just paint this area of light for me. That's fine. So, camera's set up, and the photographer really focused it. And he says to the apprentice, are you ready? He said, yeah, right, go. He said, oh, right. And he thought, if I'm doing this, again, and the photographer said, stop, I don't want you in the picture. And he goes, no, man, don't be in the picture. He said, no, it's quite a long exposure. As long as you keep moving, the light will be there, but you won't be in the picture. Good. So, right, go. So, and it's a wee bit of an answer. And then he did that. And I did that one time when people laughed. I used to do it both directions, but it used to be a reset. An issue with Germany in the first week to train. And my father was all set to go to Kodak in London and train to be a photographer. And it was all set up. Mr. Hitler invaded Poland, and Dad was called up and went to war. So what
they actually did was develop, excuse the pun, but they developed the art dealing side of the business, as was mentioned. Because what we used to do, my grandfather would borrow an oil painting, photograph it, and then sell prints. Now you might be passing by the window of our gallery, see like a Horatio McCulloch painting of Glencoe, famous painting, and you like it, you obviously can't buy that one. But in the early 1920s you could come in and buy a photogravure print. It wouldn't be colour, but it would be slightly toned print. So then the business moved on to actually selling the paintings. But we always retained the photographer, but not necessarily a member of the family. And there I am, as you do, going on holiday in your school uniform, but round my neck. When I ended up working for Shell, I had a camera in with me as I realised there was an email went out around everybody in the office, and it said, is anybody interested in photography? Please reply to this email. So I replied, interested in it, yeah. And the idea was they wanted somebody to capture any VIPs visiting and that kind of thing. And the plan was there'd be a team of volunteers would be called upon at any given time to do this. And I was that team. Nobody else volunteered. And the joke was, like then as a wee boy, I would probably always have the camera around my neck, to the extent that one of my colleagues, I was doing the real job as well as the photography side, but one of my colleagues said, do you need to get that camera surgically removed of an evening? So, but that's stood me in good stead. That was Thomas Annan, my great-great-grandfather. So say his dates were from 1829 to 1887. And I say he was born and brought up in Daresay. His father was the manager or possibly owner of a mill called Liddock's Mill, the ruins of which are still there. I was there a good number of years ago now. And he became a copper plate engraver, a firm of engravers in Cooper, and then moved to Glasgow in the same role, copper plate engraver. So he obviously very artistic to be able to do that lovely copper plate work. And then he set up a business. Originally the business was called Berwick and Annan, and he'd set it up with a friend who was really a medical doctor. And Berwick, the medical doctor, was actually interested in the scientific side of photography, the chemicals and that kind of thing. And he left to pursue a career in medicine. And then Thomas's brother Robert joined the firm. And then from there on, it was known as T&R Annan. There are more photographs taken in 2 minutes today than were taken in the whole of the 19th century. Totally out of date, I think at least 1 minute, because the number of pictures people take with their phones and so on. That was one of the old close images. If you know Glasgow at all, that's looking down. But that's down where the smoky area is in the background there. It's down towards the Tron Gate, looking down at the street. That cottage there is where the business started in 1855. As I say, it started with Berwick and Annan. What's quite interesting, the business moves from there, different premises, Suckyall Street, Charing Cross, further down Suckyall Street, premises in Lindsay and in Hamilton, and then when I was involved in the business we were in West Campbell Street, and we moved from there back to within 50 yards of this building. And I likened it to the life cycle of a salmon that starts in the stream and goes way out to the ocean, but generally comes back to the stream it was born in to spawn. And that's what we did, came back to there, and then I gave up the business, or the art dealing side of the business in 2006. So Thomas Annan at one time lived in Hamilton, and next door neighbour happened to be this gentleman's sisters. So this, of course, Dr. David Livingston. So when he came back from his journeys, he would visit his sisters and got to know Thomas Annan. So Thomas Annan took what many regard as the definitive portrait of Dr. David Livingston.
And in the firm's archives, family's archives, is the invitation to David Livingstone's funeral at Westminster Abbey, and some correspondence relating to creating some kind of memorial in Scotland, which of course we know there's a Livingston Centre at Blantyre now. This is James Craig Annan, and this is him in the dark room. It was taken by Alexander Roche, but this is him in the dark room. You can see, I mean, I don't think health and safety would pass that nowadays. I mean, he's about to trip something on the floor and bottles and all sorts of things. And even when I worked in the business, we made the premises in West Campbell Street, down in the basement we had the dark rooms, and we had 2 lead-lined sinks. And of course they weren't ideal, but the people in the council were okay with that. But the room was painted black, and they didn't accept that. And I said, or my father and I said, but it's a dark room. Yeah, but it's got to be a light. He said, well, there can't be a light, it's a dark room. And we went on, and they couldn't understand. And the solution was a white line painted round the wall, so that if there was a fire or something we needed to get out, we're supposed to follow this white line. But it was dark, you couldn't see it. That's the definitive portrait of Charles Annan Mackintosh, taken by James Craig Annan, probably by 1893. Now, Charles Annan Mackintosh is known literally all over the world. At one time, when we still had the premises in Woodlands Road, which was basically an art gallery, and we had albums with the old photographs that people could look through and buy copies and so on. But I was in there on a Saturday morning, I was sitting at a desk, and the door opens, so I stood up. And this very large American lady came in, and I'll not do the accent, but she said, hello. I went, good morning, can I help you? Yes. Is this Annan's? I said, yes. And she said, the Annans that took the portrait of Charles Annan Mackintosh? I said, yes. And who are you? I said, well, I'm Douglas Annan. Do you know who took the portrait? I said, yes, James Craig Annan. So he's got the same name as you? I went, yes. Are you related to him? Yes, he was my great-grand-uncle. Can I touch you? I just present, yes, of course you can. And then she bought a portrait, about 8 inch with 6 inch print, and she said, can I get your autograph? And I'm dead blasé, of course. And I said, now who would you call in your, we used to sign books and things. I said, now would you like it assigned to somebody, so I wrote her name on it, and she went out, floating down Woodlands Road. So, claim to fame, not. So we were also commissioned to take lots of photographs of the Charles Annan Mackintosh tea rooms. That's the Willow Tea Rooms, Suckley Street in Glasgow. Well worth a visit. It's now, it was a trust that sort of saved it. Basically, we were involved a wee bit in supplying images for it, but it's now the National Trust for Scotland that operate it. That's Charles Annan Mackintosh's wife, Margaret MacDonald, and she was very involved in a lot of his work, but again, like other subjects, that's a whole new talk for a separate time. That's very, I think, very formidable looking. That is Miss Cranston, and it was Miss Cranston that commissioned many of the tea rooms from Charles Annan Mackintosh. And she was actually married, but her trading name, if you like, was her maiden name. This was the Willow Tea Rooms again. You can see some of the design work in them was Mackintosh, and some was also Margaret MacDonald. This was one down in Argyll Street. It was known as the Dutch Tea Rooms, and the crockery was all blue, white Delft crockery from Holland. The famous sad Glasgow School of Art. I had a great privilege. Sadly, after the first fire, again, we were a wee bit involved because we had lots of images of the inside of it. Although, in fairness to them, it's probably the most surveyed building in the world. So there's lots of surveys of every corner of it. After the first fire, I was invited by the lead architect and one of the other people involved to go and have a tour prior to it reopening. And I don't know if any of you have been in the school apartment library. It's just magnificent wood beams and everything. And traditionally dark oak, very, very dark beams. And they were telling me they'd actually been to the original sawmill where in 1901 the wood came from to get the new wood for it. And it just looked magnificent. It wasn't dark, it was quite light. And then sadly, just a few weeks later, there was another fire and it's still a sad ruin. But I was chatting to a chap who was a kind of caretaker. I was just telling him my interest and my link to it, and he gave me a nail. And he said after the first fire, there was lots of, obviously there was so much fire, but down in the basement were lots of nails that had come out where the wood had burnt away. And the architect said to me as we were leaving, I was thinking about it, she said, "You're privileged. Not everybody gets a nail." So I have a nail from the original 1901 building. So that's just one of the internal views of the staircases. This was Macintosh's own house. Took photographs of that. And when they recreated the house at the Hunterian Art Gallery at the University of Glasgow, the two wee prints, if you like, on the fireplace there, Japanese prints, we enlarged images up from this. It was 8" by 6" glass plate negatives. We enlarged them as big as we could to enable the people recreating the house to get something as close to the original images to put on the fireplace. And that's just side of Charles Rennie Mackintosh you don't think of. He and Margaret didn't have children, but apparently he was very, very fond of children. That's a chap called Hamish Davidson. That was up at, I think, in Windy Hill, Kilmacole. So Charles Rennie Mackintosh, now, let's see, is there any way this pointer will work? No? No. Well, but the exposure would be so long in the glass plate, places of standing in the sun. And when I go out and do talks to like church builds, I say, and that's a university, more or less as we know today, with that ugly building stuck on the end. And at one talk I did, a lady at the back said, "My husband was involved in the design of that building." And I say, "What a fine looking ugly building it is too." So apologies if you studied engineering in Glasgow or University of Glasgow, because that is the James Watt Engineering Building. Yes.
Go back to the shooting photograph. Just out of my interest, next one.
Back?
To the back. That's the pillars are on the right hand side. What building is that there?
Over to the right, that's Wellington Church, still there to this day. Still there. And then just up from that is what's known as the reading room. It's a circular building. But it's still there, it's still part of the Church of Scotland. That's a view looking across Kelvin Grove Park, University on the right, and the art galleries we know today down on the left. There's a story told about the art galleries, and there was a competition to design a new home for basically the Glasgow Municipal Arts Collection. So the competition took place, an architect was duly chosen, and this building was being built, beautiful red locker-based sandstone. And just prior to the completion of the building, he decided to travel from his office in central Glasgow out to have a look at what of course would be his masterpiece. So out he travelled, got off the tramcar just to the left in the Art Galleries building, and he looked up and he realised to his horror it had been built the wrong way round. And he climbed to the top of the left tower as we look at it, in despair, disgust and embarrassment, and he threw himself off to his instant death on the ground below. It's a lot of rubbish. There is urban myth, Glasgow, there's lots of urban myths about Glasgow. My favourite one is the Partick Thistle and good tea. Anyway, so the urban myth is that the art galleries were built the wrong way round, Absolutely not. They were built, as we'll see later, for the 1901 exhibition. 1901 exhibition covered the whole of Kelvin Grove Park. So they were built exactly as designed, because you came in through another building and then you go into the art galleries from the park. If you've ever been there, the entrance from the park is quite grand, 2 stairs up and huge big doors, whereas at the other side, onto Argyle Street and Barton Road, it's a bit more bland. So don't spoil the myth, but it's not true. Looking down from the top of the University Tower, we took various pictures from the top of the tower over the years, but always in the month of July. Any idea why? Correct, more or less. They were taken during the fair fortnight, Glasgow Trades holiday, 2 weeks in July, because all the chimneys, all the factories would stop work for 2 weeks. And then you can still see it's a bit smoky, but you could see a wee bit further than you would normally. So that was 1905. Where the dark chimney is on the left, it's a bit of open ground. You can further down, there's more open ground, and that's the site of the Kelvin Hall today. Where the chimney is was the site of the old Yorkville hospitals and Queen Mother's maternity. That's the way we kind of know it today. That's the Kelvin Hall that's now the sports arena. It's an archive centre. If you're ever through in Glasgow, well worth going in there. Some great photographic archives that you can access. That's the second Kelvin Hall. There was a previous one burnt down in 1928. I was doing a talk to a camera club many, many years ago, and I said, yes, the previous one burned down in 1928. And the gentleman came up to me at the end and he said, you were talking about the Kelvin Hall? I said, yes. And it burnt down. And he said, yes. He said, I nearly saw it. I said, you nearly saw it? He said, yeah. He said, we stayed at Partick Cross, and the crime went up around the close, the entranceway, around all the houses on the close. The Kelvin Hall's on fire. So my parents got me out of bed, rushed me along the road, and I went, and when I got there, the fire was out. And I said, that's a shame. No, building next door was going great. That's a view again from the University Tower, but looking back into the city. Charles Wilson was the architect of the magnificent Royal Crescent up there. It would have been, if things had gone to plan, that wouldn't have existed, that crescent wouldn't have existed, because the University of Glasgow would have been built there. The original plans were to move it to there, but things got delayed. That was then built, and then the university was put on Gilmahill, as we know it today. Another of the early photographs, that's Kelvin Bridge in the West End. And what I find interesting is I do a wee talk similar to some of the photographs at the back there, old and new, and it's really hard to actually go back to some of the places. Some are clearly, up into buildings and out windows. And again, in my head, I'm going with my neck on around my neck, thinking, okay. And then I'm thinking, well, these were done with an 8. Well, this one, I know, is a 12-inch 8 camera, plugging it up the stairs to find the right window to get the picture. So, tremendous effort. This one was taken in 1905, similar view. I love that because you've got ladies on the right with the parasols to protect yourselves from Glasgow sunshine. And I mentioned old and new. Sometimes the new doesn't look that different from the old. In this particular case, it's changed a wee bit. But if you look, in many ways, it hasn't changed at all. Because just to the left of the lamppost, there's roadworks. This was Charing Cross. And that's a couple of the horse-drawn trams. The horse network, if you like, wasn't electrified until about 1898. So these were still the early days of the horse-drawn trams. And again, taken from the window of the Grand Hotel in Charing Cross. And these really capture a moment. We were talking earlier about how do you save these archives. Because these are all glass plate negatives, which are now, as I said, in the National Gallery's collection. But it's do with a means to reproduce them. And talking to a lot of people, they say the negative is not the valuable thing, it's the image from it. Now, as photographers, we may or may not disagree with that. I think where it's a very famous image, say some of the old closes, the negative itself has a value, but it's the image that's important because that remembers the scene and remembers the way it was at that time. But again, that's something for another debate. Another view of Suckyall Street. A lot of these, I think, were taken when the business was quiet and the young apprentices would be told, go out and take some photographs, you know, and just practice, because there's no kind of real reason for these being taken. The sad thing, when we moved premises from the ones I said Macintosh designed in Suckyall Street, we moved from there in 1959, and my father remembers things like 12-inch glass plate negatives, and the studio camera we had for some portraits, but for kind of reproduction work was 16 inches by 12 inches. And he remembers getting 16-inch by 12-inch glass plates and getting a razor blade and scraping this annoying negative image off so it could be a cold frame for the garden. Sad, but useless information, as you probably gathered, is one of my hobbies. That was the busiest tramway junction in the world at one time. Over 250 individual tram car movements in 1 hour. It's the corner of Argyle Street and looking along down to the right, Jamaica Street. It's taken from the Central Station Railway Bridge, otherwise known as the Hielanman's Umbrella. We crossed to the south side and we're looking back. The building kind of in the cloud or the mist to the top right says Centina Hotel. Centina Railway Station. The bridge to the right of the one with the trams on it was a temporary bridge because the bridge you're looking at there was not wide enough. As you can see, those are horse-drawn trams. You couldn't then put lamp standards up the middle to take the electric wires for the electric trams. So I think these images were probably used as records to show what the old bridge looked like, because they actually created the new bridge using a lot of the original stone. And again, this would be 1924. The corporation probably didn't have photographers, maybe they did, but depending on the circumstances, they would commission people like our firm to take photographs. That's what it would look like in colour. We didn't use colour photography in 24, so I commissioned an artist to do a painting. The Clyde is built on Glasgow, or Glasgow is built on the Clyde, and the Clyde is built on Glasgow, they say. The domed building there is probably, at one time, the most important building in the whole of the city of Glasgow, because it was the Clyde Navigation Trust, which later became Clyde Port Authority. They owned or managed, but in most cases owned, the River Clyde, or the banks of the River Clyde all the way down as far as Rawson Harbour, which then became Peel Ports that owned it, but that was the Clyde Navigation Building. If you're ever in Glasgow at Doors Open Day, well worth a visit to see the wealth in Glasgow at the turn of the century because of the shipbuilding and the trade, because that building is magnificent. Probably slightly over the top, but it's of its time. This is an interesting photograph. It's not an Annan photograph. It was taken by somebody called John Kibble. When people in Glasgow think of the name Kibble, they think of the big glass house in Botanic Gardens, known as the Kibble Palace. John Kibble was a businessman that lived at Coolport. Now I suspect his house is somewhere underneath the Faslane nuclear base now in that Coolport area, but he had a huge big greenhouse there, which was then transported to Glasgow on boats and then horses and so on. But he had an interest in this new invention of photography. This is probably about 1850, so it predates our business. But apparently his camera had to be pulled by a horse. So his camera, not the phone, his camera, the negative image apparently glass plate size was 36 inches by 24 inches. So incredible. And I'm not sure if this picture was taken with that size, but that was him. You can see lots of movement because of the length of time with the exposure. Just another view of the Clyde. And the great thing about these photographs, they are capturing and remembering a time. I don't know what's happening today because everybody takes photographs. Are we still capturing a time? Yes, you've got a brilliant collection here, but you're interested in photography. And I'm just not so sure if we're going to have the records that we had in the past. That's just some of the boats. It's said that at Glasgow Fair Friday, you could walk across the river. There were so many boats waiting to take people on holiday. That's just one of them heading down. Nowadays, that view would incorporate Squinty Bridge, the Kingston Bridge, and so on. It's just quite different. Another famous part of Glasgow, and we were very involved with it in the early days with photography, was the shipbuilding industry. And we did, it's a famous photograph, which I should have in here, I don't think it's in, of the Persia, which was built by one of the Glasgow yards, and that was about 1856, I think it was. We were commissioned to photograph it, and it was the largest steamship in the world at that time. This is Govan, and it's not shipbuilding, it's where the boats used to, the ships come back to get their hulls surveyed for the border trade certificates and so on. It's an area that for the last numerous decades is supposed to be developed, and it's gradually becoming a bit more usable. There was some talk of a maritime museum, but I'm not quite sure what's happening. Now, this is the most famous shipyard in the world, John Brown's at Clydebank. And again, we would be commissioned by the yard to go, and this is on the right, obviously, is the ship well on in construction. And just to the left of the crane on the right, there's a keel being laid down, and we would go and do various images of, staged images of the construction of the ships. And nowadays, of course, it's all done in-house and probably done on phones. I love this photograph. For a few years, maybe a couple of years, I was going out doing these talks, and I would put this up and I would say, does anybody recognise where that is? And somebody always got it right and told me it was Hunter's Quay. And I thought, that's amazing. Until I realised if you look at the bottom, it's Hunter's Quay. The sad thing in the collection of photographs that we gave to the National Gallery's collection is we had like one of Hunter's Quay. Now you didn't go with your big plate camera and take one image. There would have been quite a few taken, but we no longer have them. And possibly my father and others moving the premises, it was getting smaller, so as we said, it would get scraped or just thrown out. And it's only, we're all the same, it's only as you go older you think, I wish I'd kept that, or I wish I'd said. One thing I would say, and probably I'll do it, in the process of moving house, my wife and I found lots of photographs, and some, are from the family way back, but nobody's written on the back. So if you are printing stuff, get a nice soft pencil and write on the back, great Auntie Jeannie's birthday or something, because in years to come, well, it's a picture of somebody's unwritten, don't know. So it's always good to do that. Again, over to Rothsay. We didn't just take one picture of Rothsay. Oh, we took two pictures of Rothsay. That's looking across the bay of Rothsay. I don't know if any of you know Largs in the west coast. This is a view of Largs. I laugh, I've got grandchildren now, and I can just imagine my granddaughter's a bit older, but taking her on the beach dressed in a white outfit. It's not going to last long. Again, one picture of Largs. I don't know whether that was just taken for fun. We had a book which away with the archives that James Annan created, and it was fascinating because he went with Douglas Annan to Vienna to learn the photogravure process from a gentleman called Karl Klick, or Karl Klisch, depends how you pronounce it. But he kept a diary. He kept a diary both written but also photographically. But in some of the places they visited, they went through Germany and so on, they bought photographs. And that's kind of, I think, I don't know if that helped, but Thomas Annan started doing that. He started taking lots of photographs, and then you could buy them. Because as we said earlier, not everybody had a camera or could afford a camera, but you might go on a lovely trip to the Trossachs, to go up to Calendar, and you'd like to get an image to remind you of it. Nowadays you take a phone snap or you buy a postcard. No such thing in those days, but you could see the list of images that Thomas Annan had, their copies in the archives, and you could plan, well, that was my route. I would like one of leaving Glasgow and the steamer, one of Weems Bay, one of Rothsay, that kind of thing, and create your own album. Probably the most famous photographer for doing that was George Washington Wilson, based in Aberdeen. And some people say he was just a commercial photographer, but he was far more than that. His images are superb, and the catalogue of his images goes right across Scotland and down into England. So I guess that's maybe why there was one or two marks and billboard that people could then buy them if they wanted at a later date. Donkeys were a great feature of beaches, of course, in the early days. I can remember I mentioned I went to Ely on holiday, and it was Mr. Haig who used to have the donkeys in Ely. And when I was a wee boy, my parents kind of get my age away, but they would give me sixpence, and the sixpence was I only got it if I ran the whole length of the beach all the way to Elsferry and back. Then I was given sixpence, and that meant I could get a donkey ride. And the reason for all that is, maybe some would argue that like I am today, it was a wee bit of a pleather then. So that gave me peace and quiet for all that length of time. So. Glasgow Central Station, Glasgow Fair. These are the days you dressed up to go on holiday. Every head has got a hat on. Absolutely. There's everything there from top hats, bowlers, plain ordinary bonnets. The lady was telling me her father got 2 bonnets a year. He would get one Christmas Day to keep his heat warm in the winter, and he would get one on Fair Friday to keep the sun off his heat. So there you go. We know the date is pre-1904. People with greater wisdom than I about the Scottish Railway network know, because the railway platforms are numbering right to left in Central Station. They extended it around 1904, and they changed so that platform 1 is away to the left and platform 13 or 14 is away to the right. So this is pre that extension. 1 or 2 just boats, that's one of the canals, and that's the Forth and Clyde Canal. So you can see the kind of range. This is one picture randomly up in Oban. What we had in the archive from about, I'm going to say about 1905, were panoramic views of Oban Bay. Now, I'm not sure how they were done, if I'm being honest. I'm not sure if it's 2 or 3 images, but I know at one time we had a panoramic camera that actually was a lens, that you would see the lens moving around like that, slowly but surely. I'm not sure if it was that or if it was just stitched individual images, but very early. We even came through to the Far East. We came through to Edinburgh on occasions and took photographs. Sometimes we were taken, this I think was taken for the architects of Russell Spence who designed Renfrew Airport. So that's the kind of photographs we were involved in commercially, as well as the ones, that's the Kibble Palace and Botanic Gardens. This one amuses me because if you look at the swan in the middle, if you like, and you look at the swans looking directly at that wee boy's big toe, we'll never know. But again, these children would have no idea what this man was doing with this machine. And I really believe it's because Thomas Annan had a real compassion that he would go up and talk to these people. And Victoria Road, all the children, most of them are facing race, that's fine, you can take the photographs, they don't need to stand still. But to get a group like that to stand still, remember this one's probably about 1900, maybe slightly earlier, so it wouldn't be Thomas Annan, but it would be maybe James Craig. and he's had to go and speak to these children. Now, if we did that today, there's potential you'd be arrested. Sadly, you know, but the wee boy on the left has moved his head, so you can see it's blurred a wee bit. Just very quickly, the exhibition in 1901, that was the entrance, believe it or not. Temporary building, never meant to be permanent. That shows you in the scale. This was 1901, so you came in through that and then into the art galleries. You might be wondering what's sinking on the right side of the picture there. Here we have it, the water chute, 1901. The attention to detail, the men working the boats are wearing sailor suits. Remember, this is 1901. Keep saying it's a glass plate negative, and he's captured that boat splashing in the water. I'm pretty sure he has. I don't think there's any trickery on that negative from memory. So I used to print all these negatives as a wee boy. That shows you the art galleries in context. Now, just very briefly, of course, 5 to 5 already. Time flies. This is the series, a couple of the series of the old close images that perhaps, it depends who you speak to. Again, one of the earliest examples of documentary photography. This new art, 1868, being used as documentary evidence. It's often said the camera can't lie, and perhaps in those days it couldn't. Of course it can now, and it did a wee bit with the sky, but we can see there, looking down the high street towards Glasgow Cross, that was in the Gorbals. Just about made to the left of the shop, there's a figure standing, and there's a couple of figures to the right, very small. Main Street in the Gorbals. And it was really just about to have your buffet lunch, so I won't go into the details of the conditions people lived in, but it was horrendous. That's one of my favourites. We have the ghost on the left-hand side, where the person's come out, stood for a few seconds and then moved off. So the glass plate is recorded on there, but not long enough to get the full body, if you like. So when I'm going to groups that don't know anything really about photography, I tell them, look, managed to get a picture of a ghost. And I suspect that's the gentleman at the bottom of the steps with the bowler hat that's moved down and stood there. That one definitely the sky, a negative, 10-inch negative, 12 by 10 negative, definitely painted black on the negative. Mentioned Queen Victoria, we were commissioned to photograph the waterworks scheme from Loch Catron, bringing water down to the reservoirs in Mulgai and into the city centre. Any with an engineering background, if you know it, fantastic, because it's all gravity fed. There's no pumping at all, the water flows naturally. This is Queen Victoria opening. She turns that handle in front of her, and that's the opening of the waterworks scheme. So we were actually royal photographers to Queen Victoria. There are letters from not directly from her, but from one of her aides saying, Her Majesty is delighted with the photographs of whatever it was. Could you please send 2 more copies? Carte de visite size, which was 3 small size ones, and some in a larger format. And so we were appointed royal photographers for some time. Waiting room in the Royal Infirmary. Again, a view of Trondheim, and that's one we were looking at earlier. The tower there is still there, but the building to the left, the Druids Halls, it was known, they were all demolished some time ago, and the traffic goes either side of the tower. So again, it's a photographic record. I mentioned opening the curtains for portrait photography. I think in this building in the centre, to the right of the V-shaped bit, is a photographer's studio, I'm pretty sure. It's an area called Anderson in Glasgow, which is gone. It's basically disappeared with the approach road to the Kingston Bridge. But I'm sure that was a photographer that worked up there. Another famous building in Glasgow was the St Enos Hotel. And that's all gone. St Enos shopping centres on that site now. So these images have been used in many different books, many different ways. Buchanan Street, some are used literally in documentary evidence. Some are used for other purposes. That's the stock exchange on Buchanan Street. Somebody thought that was Aberdeen on a flag day, but I think that's a bit unkind. So I think what it's actually been is that it's a long exposure. So there would have been people moving about, but the long exposure is not captured. I mentioned photographs are used in different ways. Now, I'm trying to get it right, 1988 I think was the Glasgow Garden Festival, and that was also the centenary, 150th anniversary of the Clydesdale Bank. Clydesdale Bank headquarters is behind the tram cars to the left, or it was in those days. They approached us some years before 1988 because you can see between the trams there's lights on what was the kind of railing, and they were taken away during the war apparently to build Spitfires. This was the big thing. Pots and pans and metal fences were all taken away for the war effort. So they approached us, and what we did was we enlarged even bigger than that, so you can see the lights in between the trams. We enlarged that up, and they were able to pass that to a lighting designer and recreate as best as they could the original lamps. So the ones that you see on that building today are only going back to about 1988. And that's basically the kind of end of the talk. I kind of put in several different ends depending on what time I had, but 12 o'clock's about right, yeah. So I could say, as the sun sets and our time together, unfortunately, I'm using, I think it's the apples, but basically it's put, so after 5 generations and over 150 years, it was time to move on to something new. And basically that was that I was the last generation of Annans to be in the business, and we moved on, and I decided it's time to do something completely different. If you want to know what that is, you need to invite me back. So my photographic journey from 1855, my family's photographic journey, I always say, like going up to the Isle of Harris, as photographers, take only photographs, leave only footprints. To be continued. Thank you.
Listen to. So thank you, Douglas, and thank you, Lydia. We are breaking up now to have some lunch. There's buffet being served through in the back room. So please join us to have something to eat. We're going to reconvene back here for Colin's talk at 1 o'clock. So we'll see you back here shortly. So we'll have something to eat. Enjoy.